There is a reason this story was buried. A reason they sealed the files, erased the names, and razed the home to the ground. Because once you understand what the Sullivans were really doing in that basement, you'll never look at your country the same way again. They called her mother, not out of affection, not out of warmth, but because she made them. She trained them to whisper it like a prayer. 40 children, all from different families, different regions, different languages, but one word united them in their silent horror: mother. And the basement united them in chains. This isn't fiction. This isn't exaggeration. This is one of the most horrifying episodes ever to vanish from the annals of American history. What you're about to hear is dangerous, because it doesn't just expose one evil woman in 1860. Virginia, it unravels the entire machinery that allowed her to operate unchecked. It reveals the hidden lattice of control beneath polite society. It peels back the curtain on how an entire population can be hypnotized by appearances while children starve in silence beneath their feet. And once you see that, you start asking questions about now, about the institutions you trust, the systems you serve, the authorities you obey. That's why they buried this. But we're not here to be safe. We're here to remember what they want you to forget. Let's begin. The town of Millbrook was supposed to be unremarkable. It wasn't a plantation stronghold. It wasn't an industrial hub. It was rural, forgettable, like 1,000 other settlements in the antebellum South. And that's exactly why it was chosen. You see, predators don't hunt in the open. They hide behind fences, behind Bible verses, behind charity. And no one played the part better than Constance Sullivan. She was elegance incarnate, a lady of status, softness, and sorrow, always in mourning black, always quoting scripture, always seen but never fully known. She told the townsfolk she was caring for orphaned kin from Pennsylvania, that they were delicate, that they had seen terrible things, that they needed quiet, and so the town gave her silence. They trusted her, but beneath her home, a dungeon was being carved into the earth. Not a basement, not a root cellar, a labyrinth, room after room, hall after hall, soundproofed, reinforced, sealed with iron and stone. A child could scream for days in those walls and never be heard, and many did. But let me ask you something. How many people need to stay silent for a monster like Constance to thrive? Not just her husband, Ezra, who financed the construction and managed the records. Not just the local doctor who prescribed medicines without seeing patients. Not just the general store owner who sold enough food to feed a small army, but every neighbor who looked away, every pastor who praised her piety, every woman who heard the stories and said nothing, because the true horror of Millbrook is that it wasn't just a house of nightmares. It was a community built on selective blindness, and that blindness didn't die with the Sullivans. It's alive today in every institution that shelters corruption in plain sight, every church that buries abuse, every school that trades silence for funding, every politician who pretends not to know. You were raised to think evil looks like chaos. It doesn't. Real evil looks like order, like structure, like smiling faces and charity events and nice homes with clean fences. But if you peel back one floorboard, you find the screams. Now, most men can't handle this. They'll scroll past, they'll shut the screen. They'll tell themselves this was a long time ago, that it was just one case. But you're still here, aren't you? Good, because this is where it begins. Let's talk about the construction, Ezra Sullivan. bought the land in 1809. But the real work didn't begin until 1812, the same year his wife arrived in Millbrook. Over the next 2 decades, he hired dozens of local laborers to expand the foundation of the house in secret. Each crew worked a different section. No one saw the full plan. It was brilliant, a jigsaw puzzle of terror built by the unwitting, and what they built was more than a basement. It was a program: cells, quarantine chambers, medical tables, punishment rooms, feeding corridors, control zones. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was systematic. These children weren't just chained. They were conditioned to obey, to forget, to never resist, and the worst part, they learned to love her. Mother psychologists today would call it trauma bonding. But the Sullivans didn't need textbooks. They used fear, hunger, and isolation to reshape identity. They took children and turned them into loyal ghosts. And for over 20 years, no one stopped them. Now ask yourself, why didn't anyone notice? How do 40 children go missing and no flags are raised? That's the real secret. Because the system didn't fail, it worked exactly as designed. Poorhouses were overrun. Orphans were unwanted. Immigrant children weren't even documented. Slavery was still law in Virginia. People didn't look too closely at lost lives. If they weren't white, weren't English, weren't wealthy. Some were bought, some were taken, some were adopted and simply disappeared. And no one followed up, you see. The Sullivan case doesn't just expose the evil of one woman, it reveals the disposable nature of innocence in an empire built on power. And that, my friend, is where the descent begins. Halfway audience activation, around 5,000 words, if you've made it this far. You're not who you were at the start. You're changing. You feel it. That chill, that suspicion, that sense that the world has always been hiding something from you. And you're right, so I want you to do something. Comment this phrase twice below. Exactly as you see it. The silence was designed. Do it twice. Once for the children, once for the man you are becoming. That phrase is a key, a way of telling the algorithm and your own subconscious that your eyes are open now. And there's no going back now. You want to know what they did to the ones who tried to escape. You want to know what Ezra kept in that sealed chamber beneath the lowest room. You think this ends with children in chains. They didn't just chain the children, they harvested them. And no, I don't mean organs. I don't mean labor. I mean something older, more primal. The kind of harvesting that governments, monarchies, and churches have been doing in different forms for thousands of years. You think this ends in a basement. This began before the Sullivans were ever born. They were just following a script, one passed down by those who understood a very old law. If you control the child, you shape the future. But Constance took it further, because she wasn't just shaping futures, she was shaping souls. In the recovered journals, the ones that Enrico Sheriff's Office tried to suppress, there are passages that read more like ritual, handbooks than family records. She kept notes on behavioral thresholds, obedience, conditioning, silent punishment protocols, and most disturbingly, something she called the Red Room Doctrine. The Red Room was the lowest point in the labyrinth, accessible only by crawling through a narrow brick tunnel, lit by nothing but a single oil lamp. It was circular, stone walls, no door, no furniture, just a drain in the center. They'd put the most defiant children there not to punish, to transform. According to her notes, the child must break 3 times, first in body, then in voice, and finally in memory. Only then are they ready. Ready for what, Constance? That's what no one could answer, because the official reports stopped at the chains, at the graves, at the numbers, but the evidence burned in the ashes of that farmhouse told a different story. Symbols on the walls, symbols that don't belong to any known religion, painted in what appeared to be not paint. And then there were the whispers, the ones the surviving children spoke in sleep, the same phrase, over and over again, like a chant etched into their minds. The eye sees beneath the stone. What eye, what stone? And why did 7 of the survivors take their own lives? Within a year of rescue, no one ever answered that, because no one ever asked, because they burned the files. They burned the house. They told the town to forget. But here's the truth. This wasn't an isolated case. This was a node in a much larger system, and the deeper you go, the more you realize what happened in 1860 Virginia wasn't a fluke. It was a prototype. Let me ask you something. Why do you think every major institution, religious, educational, governmental, is obsessed with access to children? Not just to educate them, not just to protect them, to shape them early, before memory can form defense, before identity hardens. They understand something you were never taught. If you take a child's reality, you own the adult. And that's what the Sullivans did. Not just through pain, through structure. There were rules in that basement. Every child had a number. Every child had a designated mentor. Another child who had already been broken. Every day followed a schedule. Waking, feeding, discipline, recitation, prayer, stillness, silence, sleep. Recitation, that word appears in the journals again and again. Each child was made to repeat phrases, doctrines, mantras, the same ones daily, until they stopped asking what they meant, until they started to believe them. Mother sees, mother knows. The surface world is lies. We are the chosen stone. Light hurts, silence heals. We were born below. Stop. Read that again. That's not just cult language, that's indoctrination programming. The kind used in military PSOPs, the kind used in MKUltra. But this was the 1800s, which raises the real question. Where did she learn this? Because no one's born knowing how to shatter the human soul like that. She wasn't just improvising. She was executing. And if you dig far enough, if you ignore the burned files and buried archives, and you trace the name Sullivan back beyond Virginia, you hit something terrifying. You hit Pennsylvania, 1791, a Quaker orphanage called Briar Hollow, shut down after rumors of abuse. Children vanishing. One surviving report mentions a woman, dark hair, soft voice, unmarried, seen with children at night. No one ever identified her, but her initials. CSWE don't have proof. We have fragments, but that's all we ever get with this kind of history, because this isn't history written in books. This is history buried in bones. You have to feel your way through it, and if you do, you begin to realize this isn't about the Sullivan family. It's about a method used by secret societies, by ancient cults, by governments, by every elite force that's ever wanted to create perfect obedience without a single lash of the whip. Control through trauma, loyalty through dependence, worship through isolation, and the children weren't victims. In the end, they were products. What does that mean? It means some of them were released, not freed, not rescued, released, sent out into the world. planted like seeds, trained, programmed, forgotten even to themselves, until one day they wake up in a crowd, at a pulpit, behind a badge, wearing a robe, casting votes, writing curriculum, and the voice inside them still whispers, "Mother sees." Don't tell me this ended in 1860. It never ended. It evolved because the basement model works. It works in schools, in prisons, in military camps, in digital spaces. Turn the lights down, divide the people, break the identity, feed them doctrine, reward obedience, punish doubt. Congratulations, you've just created a compliant population, and the chains, they're no longer iron, they're invisible. You were born into a basement, my friend. You just didn't know it until now. There was no cross in the Red Room, no hymns, no God. There was a stone slab, circular, slightly elevated from the floor, surrounded by a ring of old ash and faint carvings etched into the walls, older than the house, older than the Sullivan. Name, older maybe than Virginia itself. This wasn't just a prison, it was a temple, and what was worshipped there had no name. Constance Sullivan didn't just want obedience, she wanted something else. The journals refer to it cryptically. The offering prepares the vessel, the ritual sustains the voice. Without sacrifice, the eye sleeps. The voice, the eye, the vessel. It would be easy to dismiss these as ravings, until you understand what that altar was used for, and who it was meant to please. In the far corner of the Red Room, behind a sliding wooden panel built into the stone, investigators found a collection of objects, a mask carved from bone, a book with no title, pages stitched from hide, and a doll made of bundled hair and teeth. Sheriff Crawford couldn't explain it. Deputy Webb refused to speak of it ever again. But one officer, young, unnamed in the reports, wrote a letter before leaving the force. It was never sent, but it was found in his belongings after his death. Here's what he wrote. There was something alive in that house. Not physically, but in the air. It watched us. It hated the light. And when we stepped into that chamber, I swear to God, it got colder. But the stone was warm. Still warm. I touched it. I shouldn't have. Why was it warm? Why, in the dead of a Virginia winter, did the altar radiate heat? No fireplace, no ventilation, no insulation, and yet the stone pulsed like it had a heartbeat. Constance's final entry gives us a clue. The blood opens the gate. The cries summon the eye, but only through suffering does it speak. She believed, truly, that her work was summoning something, not metaphorically, literally. And now the question every man watching this needs to ask is, did she succeed? Let me explain something most historians will never touch. There is a long, silent lineage of blood rites in American soil, from pre-colonial tribes banished and demonized, to frontier settlements that vanished without trace, to orphanages in the 1700s, to black site military experiments in the 1900s. Every few decades, a pocket of unexplained horror surfaces, always involving children, always surrounded by secrecy, always followed by fire, and in almost every case there's a ritual object, a circle of control, and a pattern of silence from those who should have spoken, because the true elite, the ones who move behind governments, behind wars, behind everything, understand something that you were trained to forget. Pain is a frequency. Suffering is a signal. Blood is a key. Not metaphor, not allegory, technology, that altar, that Red Room. It wasn't religious, it was functional. A chamber calibrated to break a child's spirit in a way that triggered something else. We don't know what, not fully, but we know this. It worked, because the survivors weren't normal. After they were rescued, after the house was destroyed, several were studied by early psychologists. No names were ever published, but recovered memos from one Dr. Rupert Hess described symptoms beyond trauma: heightened pattern recognition, absence of emotional reactivity to violence, disassociation in sunlight near hypnotic memory for doctrine, total amnesia of pre-basement life, spontaneous, speaking in unknown tongues, read that last one again, spontaneous speech in languages no one could trace. One girl, age 8, woke in the middle of the night and whispered to a nurse, "The stone is not asleep. It remembers every name." Now think, what was the purpose of this? Why build such an elaborate system for decades just to break children? Unless, they weren't the end goal. They were the medium, the battery, the host. Because the real goal wasn't obedience, it was access. Access to something outside or below. This world, you see. History likes to call these things insanity, evil women, abusive men, isolated incidents. But when you lay the timelines side by side, when you study the journals, the objects, the patterns, a different picture emerges. A ritual network, one that spans generations, hidden beneath farms, schools, missions, and hospitals, and always the same elements. Isolation, indoctrination, a central female figure, a chamber below a harvest event then, a disappearance. Sound familiar? The Sullivan house was just one node, one basement in a network of many, but it was important, because in her notes, Constance refers to it repeatedly as the listening house. Why? Because she believed the stone listened, and when it listened long enough, it answered. Look around today. Look at the architecture of control in your own life, the cameras, the data collection, the biometric scanning, the psychological manipulation, the endless tracking of behavior. You think this is new. It's just digital now. You were born into a labyrinth, one without walls, but with chains you can't see, and the worst part, you've been taught to love it. You were trained to see obedience as virtue, to equate silence with strength, to call trauma resilience. But what if that's not survival? What if that's programming? What if you were shaped from childhood to fear your own awakening? Because if you ever really remembered who you are, the whole system would collapse. That's why this story matters. Not because it's a horror story, but because it's a mirror. And now that you've seen it, you can't look away. The Sullivan case was never prosecuted. Let that sink in. 40 children, dozens of deaths, physical evidence, journals, survivors, but no trial, no conviction, no records of a burial, no formal charges. Within 2 months of the discovery, the farmhouse was burned to the ground in an accidental fire. The sheriff resigned, the deputy disappeared, and every surviving child was quietly placed into state custody. You know what that means? We're told the Civil War started in 1861, but what really began that year was a transfer of knowledge from fringe cults to government structure, from individual depravity to institutional design, because someone, somewhere in the chain of command, looked at what happened in that basement and said, "This works." 3 months after the Sullivan house was destroyed, the Office of Moral Behavior Studies was founded quietly under the Department of the Interior. You won't find it in your textbooks. You won't see it listed in your official history, but its fingerprints are everywhere. This office, funded initially as a post-war child welfare initiative, oversaw the creation of early orphan labor facilities, native re-education, schools, and state-run behavioral asylums. And who was appointed as the first head? A man named Dr. Frederick Allam. Never heard of him. That's by design. But his personal journals, locked in a private university archive until they were leaked in 1974, revealed something staggering. In one entry, dated 1865, he writes, "The Sullivan Protocols have been replicated in the New Hampshire trial. Results are promising. Emotional blunting observed in 70% of subjects. Ritualized obedience achieved through repeated isolation and controlled reattachment. The Sullivan Protocols. You see it now. They didn't destroy the knowledge. They preserved it, refined it, gave it new names, gave it funding. From 1865 to 1902, over 47 experimental youth behavior institutes were built across the US under the banner of Reform. But inside, the same pattern emerged. Extreme isolation, reward and punishment loops, daily recitations, emotional detachment, forbidden speech, silent surveillance. Sound familiar? You think the basement is gone. It's everywhere now. It's in the classroom where boys are drugged for asking too many questions. It's in the therapist's office where trauma is explained but never deprogrammed. It's in the HR training manual that tells you to smile while you're being broken. It's in the screens, oh God, it's in the screens, training the next generation to obey light, noise, and dopamine instead of their own gut. And it's not just government. The names connected to the post-Sullivan infrastructure, they didn't fade. They thrived. Let me show you something. Ezra Sullivan's brother, Nathaniel Sullivan, was never implicated. But he moved to New York in 1861 and became the director of an organization called Children of the Dawn, a reformatory for wayward youth. That reformatory later merged into the foundation that would become the American Psychological Association. And Constance, Sullivan's niece. She married a man named Dr. Emerson Wake, a former Union officer turned cognitive specialist. Wake went on to author a textbook in 1873 titled Breaking and Binding, The Neurology of Submission in Early Development. It became required. Reading in military academies for 40 years. You're seeing it, aren't you? What began in that basement became doctrine, not because it was moral, not because it was good, because it was effective. If you can break a child without leaving, a mark if you can rewire their loyalty, their language, their dreams, then you don't just control them, you control everyone they touch. Look at the world today. You think all these dysfunctions are random. Mass disconnection, men with no roots, children addicted to noise, truth buried beneath layers of social theater. It's not random, it's programmed. Dormancy. You were never meant to wake up. You were meant to repeat, to obey, to nod along in silence. The chains didn't vanish. They just got cleaner. They don't clang anymore. They hum. Now here's the sick brilliance of it all. The more broken you are, the more normal you seem. You hate yourself. That's called humility. You don't trust your instincts. That's called being rational. You feel numb to beauty and violence alike. That's called maturity. But what if it's not? What if that numbness is conditioning? What if your normal is the exact outcome of a system that began under a farmhouse in Virginia? Because that's the secret. They don't need to chain you if they can convince you that freedom is dangerous. They don't need to punish you if you punish yourself. But here's the pivot point. It didn't work on everyone. Some of those 40 children, they resisted, even in the dark. Even with the pain, they kept a secret language. They whispered memories to each other through grates in the wall. They scratched names into the stone, names of siblings, names of home, names they were forbidden to speak, and one phrase found carved repeatedly into the walls of the Red Room. We are not hers. They remembered, and that is what broke the spell. You can too, but you have to understand this first. You weren't just lied to. You were engineered. Your guilt, your shame, your softness, the parts of you that hesitate when power calls your name, they were installed by broken teachers, by broken priests, by broken institutions trained by even older systems that trace all the way back to a basement beneath Virginia soil. So now I ask you, will you be another product of obedience? Or will you be one of the 40 who remembered? After the fire, there were 27 children unaccounted for. Officially, they were labeled transferred to state custody. Unofficially, they vanished. No adoption records, no school enrollment, no burial sites, nothing, just gone, except there are traces, letters, whispers, declassified memos, and one name scrawled across 4 different surveillance files between 1901 and 1949. Subject S14, LO. Let me show you something. In 1906, a patient was admitted to the New Jersey State Asylum under the name E. Hallister. Female, age estimated 53. No birth record. No next of kin. She never spoke. Never slept through the night. Refused all food unless it was placed in a circle of salt on the floor. And every night, without fail, she would draw the same pattern on the wall with her fingernail. A spiral inside a triangle inside a sunburst. That symbol, it matches exactly the etchings found beneath the Sullivan altar, and also appears faintly in the original seal of the Department of Health and Human Services before it was redesigned in 1979. Coincidence? No such thing. The patient escaped in 1910. No trace. No recovery. But 1 month later, a girl named Eloise appeared in the personal journal of Dr. Nathaniel Kervin, a neurologist working with the Federal Orphan Relocation Board. In his notes, he writes, "The girl speaks in riddles, knows things no child should, described my home before I told her where I lived. When shown an image of the Sullivan house, she wept, then whispered, 'The stone still breathes.' She would have been around 8, and if the timelines are right, she was born in the basement. So now, ask yourself, why would the government track a single child for decades? Why would she end up in the custody of covert federal programs by the 1930s? Why would she appear in a list of special case studies? Sent to M-Culture affiliates in 1951. Yes, that MK-Ultra. Because here's what they found. Some survivors weren't just broken. They were rewired, and when placed under hypnosis or extreme emotional triggers, they accessed information they shouldn't have. They spoke in patterns, predicted behavior, reacted to unseen stimuli, and most chilling of all, they remembered. The altar. Let's go back. The Journal of Constance Sullivan includes one final passage, written in a different hand, likely by one of the children. Her eyes are closed now, but the stone listens still. We are its dream, and it has not yet woken. That line was dismissed by historians as poetic nonsense, but in 1993, a psychological study conducted on trauma victims showed something strange. When exposed to certain frequencies between 17 Hz and 19 Hz, subjects with early childhood trauma experienced sudden, involuntary flashbacks of enclosed spaces, accompanied by visions of a circular room and a voice, whispering from beneath the floorboards. The study was buried because some of the subjects had no known history of trauma. This is where it gets darker. A leaked 1982 memo from the U.S. Department of Defense lists 27 unidentified children from historical cases under spiritual duress. All are labeled as vectors, not people, vectors, as in carriers, transmitters, nodes in a system. Why would the government, a modern, secular institution, use spiritual language like that, unless, unless what happened in that basement wasn't just abuse, unless it was a signal meant to carry forward, through blood, through memory, through you. Now let me bring this full circle. The seal of the Department of Health and Human Services, from its inception until 1979, bore three faint elements behind its official emblem: a spiral, a sunburst, and beneath them, barely visible, a triangular lattice. Overlay those with the carvings from the Sullivan altar. Perfect match, not approximate, exact. So here's the question. Why would the modern arm of American child policy carry the symbol of a ritual chamber buried under a farmhouse in Virginia? Answer: because it was never about care. It was about continuity. The system is not broken. It's operating exactly as designed. After the fire, there were 27 children unaccounted for. Officially, they were labeled transferred to state custody. Unofficially, they vanished. No adoption records, no school enrollment, no burial sites, nothing, just gone, except there are traces, letters, whispers, declassified memos, and one name scrawled across 4 different surveillance files between 1901 and 1949. Subject S14, LO. Let me show you something. In 1906, a patient was admitted to the New Jersey State Asylum under the name E. Hallister. Female, age estimated 53. No birth record. No next of kin. She never spoke. Never slept through the night. Refused all food unless it was placed in a circle of salt on the floor. And every night, without fail, she would draw the same pattern on the wall with her fingernail. A spiral inside a triangle inside a sunburst. That symbol, it matches exactly the etchings found beneath the Sullivan altar, and also appears faintly in the original seal of the Department of Health and Human Services before it was redesigned in 1979. Coincidence? No such thing. The patient escaped in 1910. No trace. No recovery. But 1 month later, a girl named Eloise appeared in the personal journal of Dr. Nathaniel Kervin, a neurologist working with the Federal Orphan Relocation Board. In his notes, he writes, "The girl speaks in riddles, knows things no child should. Described my home before I told her where I lived. When shown an image of the Sullivan house, she wept, then whispered, 'The stone still breathes.' She would have been around 8, and if the timelines are right, she was born in the basement. So now, ask yourself, why would the government track a single child for decades? Why would she end up in the custody of covert federal programs by the 1930s? Why would she appear in a list of special case studies? Sent to M-Culture affiliates in 1951. Yes, that MK-Ultra. Because here's what they found. Some survivors weren't just broken. They were rewired, and when placed under hypnosis or extreme emotional triggers, they accessed information they shouldn't have. They spoke in patterns, predicted behavior, reacted to unseen stimuli, and most chilling of all, They remembered. The altar. Let's go back. The Journal of Constance Sullivan includes one final passage, written in a different hand, likely by one of the children. Her eyes are closed now, but the stone listens still. We are its dream, and it has not yet woken. That line was dismissed by historians as poetic nonsense, but in 1993, a psychological study conducted on trauma victims showed something strange. When exposed to certain frequencies between 17 Hz and 19 Hz, subjects with early childhood trauma experienced sudden, involuntary flashbacks of enclosed spaces, accompanied by visions of a circular room and a voice whispering from beneath the floorboards. The study was buried because some of the subjects had no known history of trauma. This is where it gets darker. A leaked 1982 memo from the U.S. Department of Defense lists 27 unidentified children from historical cases under spiritual duress. All are labeled as vectors, not people, vectors, as in carriers, transmitters, nodes in a system. Why would the government, a modern, secular institution, use spiritual language like that, unless... Unless what happened in that basement wasn't just abuse, unless it was a signal meant to carry forward, through blood, through memory, through you. Now let me bring this full circle. The seal of the Department of Health and Human Services, from its inception until 1979, bore three faint elements behind its official emblem: a spiral, a sunburst, and beneath them, barely visible, a triangular lattice. Overlay those with the carvings from the Sullivan altar. Perfect match, not approximate, exact. So here's the question. Why would the modern arm of American child policy carry the symbol of a ritual chamber buried under a farmhouse in Virginia? Answer: because it was never about care. It was about continuity. The system is not broken. It's operating exactly as designed. In 1954, the CIA coined a phrase in an internal memo that was never meant for the public eye: subemotional architecture. The construction of identity via trauma-next sensory gating, implemented during developmental windows to yield a compliant ego formation. Let me translate that for you. It means designing a personality from the inside out by controlling what pain you feel, when and how often. And guess what? They traced this entire framework back to something called the Sullivan Lexicon. Now, if you've been following, you remember the Sullivan journals, especially those authored by Constance Sullivan between 1857 and 1860. She didn't just record abuse. She systemized it. She wrote in codes, rituals, cycles. Every child broken and rebuilt according to their frequency of resistance. The lamb resists gently and weeps. The fox resists in silence. The raven resists with rage. All may be made to kneel, but only the lamb will sing while doing it. C.S. April 1860, that quote. It was reproduced, nearly verbatim, in a 1973 training manual for Cold War field interrogators. Page 17. Same structure, same language. So here's the uncomfortable question. How did 19th century torture blueprints from a Virginia farmhouse end up embedded in the psychological warfare doctrine of the US government? Answer: because someone kept it alive, and that someone had a name: Dr. Joseph E. Sullivan, born 1909, psychologist, lead advisor to the Department of Defense. From 1951 to 1967, founder of the Kirvan-Sullivan Emotional Resilience Index, still used today in military screening and at-risk youth. programs. You read that right. A direct descendant of the Sullivan family. And he did not hide it in one of his rare interviews. He said, "The world does not need more free thinkers. It needs more stable instruments." That was always the Sullivan dream. Now, let's jump to 1966. A declassified CIA training document, MK Radius. Emotional containment and cognitive yield optimization includes a section titled The Behavioral Sink. It defines the term as a terminal collapse of behavioral boundaries, identity cohesion, and moral structure, resulting in docile, emotionally blunted subjects with high obedience and low self-agency. Now, here's the twist. This term wasn't invented in a lab. It was first used in 1860 by Constance Sullivan. The sink is achieved when the child ceases all attempts at moral correction, seeking instead only direction. Then, and only then, can the new identity be poured in. Journal entry, June 13th, 1860. That's not science. That's ritual language, which means the very language we use to describe psychological control today, is rooted in spiritual sacrifice. They didn't just inherit the techniques, they inherited the philosophy. Let me show you how this plays out right. Now, modern foster care and group homes use resilience scoring to determine intervention. But in 2015, a leaked scoring sheet from a juvenile program in Oregon showed something deeply disturbing. The scoring penalized children who asked too many abstract questions, refused rote tasks without emotional reaction, drew recurring spiral or triangle patterns during assessments. Why does that matter? Because those are the exact flags listed in the 1958 MCulture Psychic Vector Screening Form. Even more, those symbols, spirals, triangles, the sunburst, you've seen them before, in the Sullivan altar, in Eloise's drawings, and hidden behind the seal of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, until 1979. They've been watching, filtering, suppressing, because they knew some of the children came back different, not broken, rewired, and they carried something that listened, that remembered, that refused to die. You think this ends in the past? No, they built a world to keep it alive. Schools that train obedience, diagnoses that neutralize resistance, entertainment that mimics ritual exposure cycles, and childcare systems that harvest the ones who still see through the veil. This is not a conspiracy theory, it's a continuity plan. And the Sullivans, they didn't vanish, they went institutional. She was always 8 years old. That's what the records say. Different names, different states, same face, between 1972 and 2016. At least 12 separate group homes across the US documented the arrival of a small girl, pale skin, long black hair, rarely spoke, drew spirals obsessively. Each file listed her as a new intake. No birth certificate, no prior records, just appeared. Here's what makes it worse. In each case, she arrived days before a catastrophic internal event, a fire in Kansas, a staff suicide in Maine, a full-on riot in an Ohio group home that left 7 dead, and in every single case, after the incident, the girl disappeared. No forwarding address, no discharge papers. Gone. The only thing left behind. A drawing. Always the same. A red room, 13 chairs, and a door with no handle. Let me ask you something. Have you seen that drawing before? Not recently, I mean, when you were young. Because some viewers of this very series have written in describing the exact same image from childhood dreams, decades before we release this video. And that's not coincidence. That's a leak in the system. Because the Red Room wasn't just a place. It was a template, a pattern. 13 chairs, 12 minds to fracture, 1 to witness. See Sullivan, 1860, that's the rule. And that's what the girl was, the witness. Now let's talk Walter Reed, the largest military hospital in the United States. Public tours are limited, but beneath the main structure is Wing B4, sealed off since 1983 after a chemical incident. Except it wasn't chemical, it was linguistic. A private contractor accidentally played back an encrypted Sullivan ritual recording through the PA system at full volume during a psychological resilience drill. 17 people collapsed. 3 entered fugue states. 1 nurse began repeating the phrase, "The witness is not to speak. The witness is to remember." Sound familiar? That same phrase was carved in reverse into the underside of a child's bed frame in the 1860s. Sullivan basemen still think this is all just history. Let me show you something worse. In 2021, an investigative journalist gained access to a foster care rehoming program in rural Montana. He discovered a series of intake forms labeled Proxy Viability Index, Modal and Unbeat. These weren't forms for adoption. They were tests: emotional response under stress, compliance to nonverbal cues, ability to disassociate on command. Out of 214 children tested, only 3 passed. Those 3 were quietly transferred to a facility in Idaho. Facility name: Red Room Learning Center, a real building, still active, posing as a therapeutic creative arts school. Now pause. Ask yourself, why would children who disassociate on command be useful to anyone? Answer: because they're not raising children. They're training vessels. And this is where it gets personal. Because every AD you've ever seen, every rhythm you were taught to walk in the bells at school, the tone at the end of class, the game over music in early video games, all of it was crafted to condition resonance, to tune your nervous system to expect control. And when you stepped out of line, diagnosed, treated, or worse, redirected. Some of you were sent to programs, camps, centers for emotional adjustment. Others, you just forgot. You chose to forget, because the Red Room doesn't need walls. It just needs repetition. Let me ask you something simple. Have you ever walked into a room and forgotten why you entered? Have you ever had a dream about a hallway you've never seen, but somehow know the layout by heart? That's not imagination, that's leakage. Because the children they built in basements, they didn't die out. They grew up, they run things now. They design your screens. They write your scripts. And if this story feels too familiar, it's because part of you was in that Red Room too.